So how do you actually use one of these things to teach? Today, we're looking at how do you actually teach with a puppet. We aren't going to go into the actual techniques of how do you actually talk with the puppet. I have a video for that down in the description if you want to know that. We're going to be talking about how do I use this puppet for teaching. The key is storytelling. Using a puppet to tell a story is the main way I've used puppets in my teaching. Stories are very powerful, and combining them with puppets can make them very effective. As I mentioned in the video Teaching with Puppets, there's a big difference between someone picking up a puppet and waving it around versus somebody actually using a puppet effectively for teaching. In that video, we talked about the 3 main keys that you need to know in order to take full advantage of using puppets. And you'll need to know those keys before moving on to storytelling, because each of those keys is put into practice here. For coming up with a story and teaching with it, there are 3 main steps that I use. Step 1 is the main teaching. The first step is to simplify the main teaching. What's the point? What are they even supposed to walk away with? This is the minimum you want them to get. This should be simple and condensed. Don't have 10 points that they can learn. They will end up not getting any of them. This should be clear to you and also clear to your students. If you can't clearly state what you wanted them to end up with, how could they? Be sure it's simple. That doesn't mean it's dumbed down, but just not overly complicated or too many words. Be sure it's clear and not too big or too vague. Some examples of main teaching I've taught is God is good, being thankful to God. You are made wonderfully by God. Jesus is the only way for salvation. There are often many main teaching within a concept, but you gotta pick one that you will focus on because that directs everything else. So that's the first step, deciding a main teaching. You'll hear me say this a lot because this is really a big one. This is the foundation that everything is built on. Step 2, the action of the story. Once you have your main teaching, you focused on what you want to teach. The next step is coming up with an action of the story. Since we're going to teach that main teaching using a puppet in a story, we must build the story next. The action is the climax of the story. What's the exciting part that reveals the main teaching? In what situation would this be learned? For example, once my main teaching was listening to authority. Now, the action of the story, I want it to be something about not listening. What happens when you don't listen to those who know better? I want it to particularly show how it affects our life. So, traveling to a destination would be a good illustration. So I put traveling and not listening to authorities together to end up with the action of that story being a puppet who ended up getting lost while driving because he didn't listen to the GPS. There's different things that happen in the story, but the main climax was he ended up getting lost because he wasn't listening. For the main teaching of telling the truth, the action of the story could be a little lie that keeps growing out of control. That's the action of the story. It's the big picture of the story. It's usually better the more extreme or crazy it is. Think of something that's very dramatic that could happen. If the story is bigger than life, it's more likely to hold attention than just a run-of-the-mill everyday situation. Now, the action of the story is usually the hardest part, but it also is the part that will make or break the story. So be sure it's exciting and interesting. Once you have the main teaching and the action of the story, the next step is step number 3. Before we move on, if you're getting value out of this video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button. If you teach kids, then you need to know about the Kid 1 training course. After years of teaching, my team and I have organized the best tips and techniques into a children's ministry training course that will teach you what actually works. The link is down in the description, so be sure to check it out. Step number 3, the storyline. The main teaching is what you're going to teach through the story, and the action is that main climactic thing that happens in the story. So next is organizing the storyline. I recommend getting an index card for this part. What we're going to do is we're going to create an outline of what happens. I prefer to use the Story Mountain framework. Here's how it works. The story starts off with an introduction or background information. This kind of outlines the situation and the main character is introduced. This is Bobby. He's a normal boy, except sometimes he would tell little lies. One day, he was going over to his friend's house. After the introduction is rising actions, where things keep getting worse and worse. Think about it like a small situation that then becomes a medium situation that becomes a big problem. These are things in the story that are not really a big deal, but they lead up to that climax. These should be increasingly more dramatic until finally leading to the biggest one, the climax. I usually prefer 2 or 3 smaller actions that lead to that climax. Finally, there is the climax, which is the dramatic part of the story. The action of the story that you came up with earlier, this is going to be the climax of the story. Then there is the resolution, and then the end of the story. Plan out how the story is resolved so you know how to bring the story to a conclusion. Once you have it figured out, put your story down in bullet points on that card. These should be short and just the main parts. For example, for the introduction, I would put a bullet point like, normal boys sometimes lies. Once you have your story lined out with your introduction, 2 or 3 rising actions, the climax, then the resolution, after that, you need to start practicing your story. Actually tell the story using that outline. Now, your story is ready to be told. Using puppets to teach effectively is a great skill, but there's much more to teaching kids. If you'd like to learn how to really be effective in teaching kids in Sunday school, VBS, or other children's ministries, then be sure to check out the Kid 1 training course. I have it linked down there in the description, so be sure to check it out. We'll see you next time.